The hair. Okay, good morning, Rabbi Light. The goal of today, we'll have a shorter shiur to do part 2 of the Sabbath mode. And just a quick review, really we're getting into the whole concept of grama on Shabbos and Yontif. So we'll have a brief summary of what we established last week. So last week we saw that there seems to be a contradiction between the Gemara and Shabbos on Daf Kuf Chaf, where we derive from a pasuk that grama on Shabbos is not a problem. Asiyahu da'asar grama shari. So generally speaking, it sounds like from that Gemara, grama on Shabbos, if you could figure out a way to do a malacha where it's indirect, it's not really me, it's not my maisa, there's some kind of time delay. Whatever classifies as grama, if you could do that on Shabbos, it's mutter. Then we had the Gemara in Baba Kama and Daf Samach, where there it seems to say, the case of Zora, throwing up all of the chaff and the kernel in the air, and utilizing the wind to separate the chaff and then have the kernels fall back down to the earth. So there, the Gemara seems to say in the last answer of Ashi, that's also a grama. That's not your maisa, but you're still chayiv for that because, and here we have to fill in the blank according to Rashi and according to the Rush. Rashi said you're still chayiv for that because that was your machshava. Well, first off, the Gemara's language is meleches machsheves asra Torah. The Gemara says the reason why you're responsible for utilizing the wind is because in the realm of Shabbos we have something called meleches machsheves, that even if it's not a real direct maisa, because we pay so much attention to your machshava when it comes to malacha, your machshava, your intent, makes it viewed as your maisa. So Rashi says, it seems like a general guiding principle that even if you're doing something on Shabbos that technically would be grama, if you're trying to accomplish the malacha, and you're doing the malacha through this grama, so then we view it as your maisa. That's how Rashi says pshat in the Gemara. The Rush, we noted, seems to say a little bit of a different pshat. The Rush learns the Gemara that maybe it's dafka by malacha like Zora, where that's how you do the malacha. The malacha is defined as an indirect maisa. I'm not doing it myself. I'm harnessing a natural force. And nonetheless, the Torah said that's one of the lamed tes malachos. So according to the Rush, you could say it's not that much of a stira. The Gemara in Baba Kama was telling us, the Gemara in Shabbos rather was telling us, generally speaking, if you take a regular malacha and you do it in an indirect way, that's not a problem on Shabbos. However, there's one or maybe a few exceptions to that rule, namely if that's how the malacha is generally done. So then HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, I don't care if it's a grama, meleches machsheves asra Torah, this is what the Torah says is asr. So according to the Rush, there's not that much of a stira. According to Rashi, we noted that it becomes much more difficult because Rashi seems to be learning the Gemara in Baba Kama not as an exception to the rule, but he seems to be saying, whenever you're mechavein, you have an intention to accomplish a malacha, even if it's al yedei grama, thank you, Rabbi Aram, that becomes conceptually as if you did it biyadayim. So in Rashi, we definitely had more of a contradiction between the two Gemaras. We saw the Achiezer. That's what we left off with last week. Achiezer really creates a fundamental distinction, and he's not the only one that takes this approach. There's a source here from the Ma'orei Eish, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, when he was a young man. He wrote the Sefer Ma'orei Eish, all of the different halachos of electricity, and he quotes here from Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer, who has pretty much the same distinction that the Achiezer makes, which is grama on Shabbos is mutter. The definition of grama, though, is when it's ba b'mikra. This is not the way it's generally done. Meaning it doesn't have to be as confined as the Rush, where the Rush was saying the only time you're chayiv for grama is if this is what the malacha is. You could say broader. Achiezer was saying, any malacha, you're always pater for grama if you're doing it in a derech that's ba b'mikra, that we don't view it as the normal way of doing it. Not as shinui, but you're creating something that's an indirect, a time delay. It's not really my maisa, and I'm accomplishing the grama. But like the case in Shabbos, the way I'm putting out the fire is I'm just placing kalim around the fire, and when the fire gets to the kalim, they break and the water puts out the fire. That's very baba mikra. In contrast to, anytime you have a mechanism where this is the way the machine works, even if there are other ways of doing the malacha, even if in the times of the Mishkan, nobody did tochein using a water mill, doesn't make a difference. If this is a very common way that you could accomplish a malacha in this present time and place, that would be considered your maisa, even if there is some level of time delay. That was the distinction of the Achiezer. Am I speaking English so far? Mostly. A little bit of Yiddish, a little bit of... So the Rush you could read, as the Rush might be saying that Baba Kama is much more of an exceptional case, where it's only a malacha, where the malacha itself is, even though it's grama, you're still chayiv. Meaning you could argue in the Rush's world that, in this case, we brought up it's a machlokas achronim, the Magen Avram and the Even HaOzer, by the case of the water mill. The water mill was a new invention, hundreds of years ago, and it would basically you just put the tavua into the water mill, and then the machine does the grinding. So you could argue, if you read the Rush, I guess in its most pure form, the Rush would say, this is a malach of tochein, and tochein in the Mishkan was done b'yadayim. So this is not what the malacha is. And therefore what? And therefore you'd be pater, maybe the Rush would say. Right? What the Achiezer is suggesting, and this we said, the machlokis, the Rush and Rashi might be similar to the machlokis, the Magen Avram and the Even HaOzer. There's a lot to get into here. But what the Achiezer is suggesting is that even if this was never done in the Mishkan, they didn't have the technology in the Mishkan, but if this is a normal way of doing the malacha, even if there is some kind of time delay, that would not be baba mikra, that would be considered your maisa. Now, we did point out that the Mordechai quotes from the Rabbeinu Yoel, this is the Mordechai in the Gemara in Shabbos, that although the pasuk says, or we have a drasha, that grama on Shabbos is permissible, it could be that midrabanan it's only permissible in a similar case to the Gemara, where your table was on fire. It's b'makom hefsed. Now, we didn't see any other Rishonim make that stipulation. And then when we looked in the halacha in Shin Lamed Daled, the Mechaber quotes over that Mishnah and that Gemara in Shabbos as Stam, grama is mutter, and he makes no mention that it's only mutter in a situation of financial loss or a shas at chak. So the Mechaber seems to be learning Pashut Pshat, that grama is always mutter. However you define grama on Shabbos, it's mutter. It's not even asur midirabanan. Now the Ramah does add in those two magic words in Shin Lamed Daled, qualifying the Mechaber, and he says it's mutter only in makom hefsid, in a situation of financial loss. Otherwise, doing a grama on Shabbos for no good reason would be asur midirabanan. Okay, so at least Ashkenazim we generally assume like the Ramah. Now, there's a Sharet Tziyun in Taf Kuf Yud Daled. That's in the Siman discussing Kibui and Yontif, right? Shin Lamed Daled is Kibui and Shabbos, and Taf Kuf Yud Daled is Kibui and Yontif. And the Sharet Tziyun points out in Lamed Aleph that there seems to be a contradiction in the Ramah. The Ramah in Shabbos and Shin Lamed Daled makes the stipulation that grama is only permissible when there's a hefsid. The Ramah, however, in the halachos of Yontif, makes no mention that grama is only allowed when there's a hefsid. It's mashma that the Ramah would say, right? For no good reason. You still want to do a malacha b'derech grama on Yontif, go for it. So this is a stira that the Magen Avram brings up. And the Magen Avram gives an answer, but the basic approach of the Magen Avram is, in the world of the Ramah, grama is only mutter when there's a hefsed. That's true regarding Shabbos, and that's also true regarding Yontif. Comes along the Sharet Sion quoting the Maimar Mordechai and says, Maimar Mordechai was of the opinion that the reason why the Ramah didn't have the stipulation of makom hefsed on Yontif is because he was of the opinion that on Yontif there is no need for makom hefsed, meaning to say that on Yontif the Ramah would agree to the Mechaber, that you'd be allowed to do a malacha if you're doing it in a gramadik way, even if there's no hefsed involved. And the Sharet Sion seems to be coming out like the Maimar Mordechai. So if you were to ask the Chafetz Chaim, as we're going through this whole discussion of grama, would you tell me that according to the Ramah, if I could figure out how to do a malacha b'derech grama on Yontif, it would be permissible even if there was no financial loss, even if there was no great shas at chak? It sounds like the Chafetz Chaim would say, yes, there's room to be meko like that. You could argue the whole shaila is of a shaila b'derabanan. And it's not the Chafetz Chaim himself and the Maimar Mordechai. We also have the Aruch HaShulchan, who seems to be on the same page, that when it comes to Yontif, there's no need for makom hefsid to allow grama. On the other side of the equation, we do have the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram and the Shulchan Aruch HaRav and the Chai Adam, many other great poskim who seem to feel the Ramah would only allow grama if there's a hefsid both by Shabbos and Yontif. So this is a big machlokis achronim. Let's make some applications. Okay, so in the olden days they had something that was called the timer, where you would adjust it manually. Question, doctor?
About multi-method so the Rama would say with the water wheel, no, for Shabbos, right?
The Ramah regarding the watermill. So the Ramah would say, right, even if theoretically you would view that as a grama, which was the approach of the Magen Avram in contrast to the Even Ozer, the Ramah on Shabbos would say that's still only permissible b'makom hefsid, b'shas chak, and he would say on Yontif, according to the Magen Avram, that would be fine.
So is loss of money only on sort of what exists now or future potential? Because you could say, okay, well, if I keep my water mill running all Shabbos and I grind grain, I'll have more to sell and I can make more money. So it's a loss. It's kind of like I'm shutting down my factory for Shabbos.
So that's a good question. How do you define hefsid? Is hefsid only that I have a table here that's going to be destroyed? That's makom hefsid. Or is hefsid right now, Baruch Hashem, I'm not losing any money, but it's manias harevach. I'm not able to make money in the future if I don't continue putting grain into the watermill on Shabbos. Generally speaking, and this applies in many areas of halacha, we do make that distinction between real hefsid in contrast to manias harevach. If you're just losing out potential profit in the future, we would not view that as a real hefsid. Now, even how to define hefsid is a good question. There's a Pischei Tshuva in Yoredeya where he quotes from different achronim who say hefsid is very subjective. Right? The loss of $20 to one person might be no big deal, and that's barely even a hefsid. And to someone else, that might be a hefsid meruba. Right? So it comes out as a very subjective type of thing. So some applications. In the olden days, they had timers you could just adjust manually. So let's say I have everything plugged in from before Shabbos, and I'm realizing that my lights are only supposed to turn on Friday night at 8 p.m. But we're going to be getting home from shul a lot earlier than that, and it gets darker earlier in the winter. So, what do I do? It's already Shabbos. Can I adjust them that now they're going to go off, or go on rather, at 6 p.m.? So the question is that considered a grama, or is that a maisa biyadayim? That's a direct action. So Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, he has three different tshuvas on this subject. The first going back to his original Sefer Ma'orei Eish, and then in the tshuvas, right, in the Mincha Shlomo, and then we find in the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, and there's somewhat of an evolution in his worldview on timers. But the Pasha Pshat, Rav Shlomo Zalman held that it's considered a grumma to adjust the timer, because what you're doing is you're putting something in, right? You're pressing down the button where now I'm basically setting it up that the light's going to turn on in 2 hours from now, or I'm setting something up where the light's going to turn off 2 hours from now. I'm not doing a direct ma'isa, it's a grumma. If that's true, you could argue on Shabbos, if we're assuming like the Sharat Tzion's understanding of the Ramah, that you only need Hefsid Meruba, Shasid Chak on Shabbos, but not Yontif, and assuming that adjusting a timer is considered grama, then we would probably say, on Shabbos you cannot adjust the timer unless there's a Shasid Chak. Now, a Shasid Chak doesn't have to be even a financial consideration. There could be, let's say, an issue of, the kids need to go to sleep, some kind of like real need. Then the Ramah would say adjusting the timer on Shabbos should be mutter. If there's no Shasid Chak, it would be Asr. On Yontif, assuming adjusting a timer is grama, and you're also assuming that the Ramah doesn't need hefsid at all when it comes to Yontif, you could adjust the timer just because it's more convenient, right? So there is a question that is adjusting a timer muktzah. And this is a debate between Rav Moshe and Rav Shlomo Zalman. But likely you could argue, if you're of the opinion that adjusting it is or at least can be mutter, so then it wouldn't be muktzah in the first place, right? No, then you could argue really it's a klisha malachta leheter, because this is actually made to adjust on Yontif lamashal. It's mutter even without a hefsid, and on Shabbos it's mutter when there is a hefsid. Or you could tie to maybe it's a klisha malachta leiser, but I'm touching it, I'm moving it litzorach gufo. But the question is, what's its main function? Rav Shlomo Zalman held that it was not muktzah. Rav Moshe held that it was muktzah. Yes, question?
Well, this actually happened to me this Shabbos. I lit candles and I look at my hot plate and I realize it's no longer on because I had cut it perfectly, but I had set the timer so it was like 9 o'clock at night. So I was fortunate I had someone else able to run in and have it. I just lit and they turned it. But like even if I wanted to adjust it, in order to get it to the right time, I would have had to go through many different segments of on and on and off. You would only be able to put it to right at the end of that. If it was off, I would only be able to put it to the end of that off section, so it's almost going to turn on. I can't turn it on. Right? There are different types of timers.
Yeah, listen, there are different types. There are different kinds of timers. But yeah, listen, these questions come up in all shapes and forms. The question really is conceptually, if I'm doing something now to make a light go on or off, or to make the hot plate go on or off in a couple of hours from now, is that grama or is that your actual maisa? So Shlomo Zalman seems to say it's grama. Rav Moshe argued on that. Rav Moshe, we have two tshuvas. I did not photocopy them here, but there are two different tshuvas where Rav Moshe says setting up a timer is not considered grama. You're putting something into motion. That's maisa biyadayim. That's considered your action. It's the same thing as throwing something in slow motion, right? It's still me. It's my force. I'm creating this ongoing movement. Rav Moshe held that we're not going to have time to analyze Rav Moshe versus Rav Shlomo Zalman, but just to have in the file cabinet, that Rav Moshe held that timers were considered your actual maisa, in which case Shabbos and Yontif aser. And Rosh Shlomo Zalman held that it's a grama, in which case you could argue that maybe Shabbos b'makom hefsid it's mutter, maybe Yontif it's mutter, although Rosh Shlomo Zalman himself, when he was asked about timers, did not seem to be a huge fan of adjusting timers for no good reason. Halacha l'maisa, he was very hesitant to allow people becoming too comfortable adjusting chashmal on Shabbos.
Is it even also before Shabbos to set up a timer?
So before Shabbos, Rav Moshe has his tshuva on the subject. He was not a big fan of setting up timers before Shabbos, with the exception of lights. But that seems to be the minig alma. The sugya d'alma is we do set up timers before Shabbos, even on other things besides lights. I want to go a little bit further here, because this is more of the background. Okay, let's jump into the chiddush of the Star K oven. Now we have some chevra here from Baltimore, so I'm a little bit intimidated. What I have here are a few selected pieces from Rav Heinemann's tshuva. This goes back circa 2008 or so. It's been a while. In the olden days, yes. When my kids want to refer to the fact that we're very old, they'll say like, okay, maybe in the 1900s. Right? Okay, so this is not quite that old. So Rav Heinemann has the following chiddush. Now the Star K oven, or any oven similar to this, can be very helpful in many ways that have no connection to this entire discussion or machlokus. For example, a regular oven many times shuts off automatically after 12 hours. So if it's a 3-day yontif, that's not convenient, right? And a Jewish oven could avoid that. You put it on Sabbath mode, that it stays on. That's one incredible mila. A second mila is you might have an oven that when you open the door of the oven, the light goes on. And having it on Sabbath mode, the light always stays on, or it stays off, however they engineer it. So there are many very practical benefits of having a halachically engineered oven. I do want to point out that the term Sabbath mode, I feel, has been very misunderstood by the masses, because people assume that once my oven is on Sabbath mode, that means I could use it on the Sabbath. Not that crazy, right? It says Sabbath mode. Now, I know you can't cook on Shabbos. Most people know that. But the greatest misconception that I've seen throughout the years is that people assume I could take out the challah from the freezer, or I could take out the schnitzel from the fridge and put it inside the Sabbath mode oven to heat up for Shabbos day. What could be wrong with that? The answer is that's a violation of Chazorah. That's a real Isser D'Rabbanan, a Mexican Mavashal. So I do think the term Sabbath mode has thrown off people, but just that it should be clarified, Sabbath mode never allows us to put food inside of the oven on Shabbos, even if that food is fully cooked. Okay. Now the main chiddush, though, of Rav Heinemann and the Star K was we could create an oven where not only is it helpful that it stays on for as long as you want it and the lights don't go on and off when you open the door, but there's an added feature that you could adjust the temperature on the oven. Even though you're not turning a knob and raising the gas, what are you doing? You're actually pressing the buttons. Now, Pashut Pshat, pressing buttons to create a fire would be problematic. First of all, when you're pressing those buttons, you're utilizing electricity, right? This is a computer system here. You're playing with fire, Rabbi Light. You have to bring that in at some point. Okay. Now we're Yotze, we're fine. Okay. But so you're obviously utilizing chashmal. Now, the truth is, and we've had conversations on this in the past, using electricity, if it doesn't generate red hot metal, is not considered a creation of a fire. Right? Turning on a fan, using really most electrical appliances that are not a hot plate or a crock pot. So it's not considered I'm creating fire. It's not a violation of lo sevaru eish. What is the isser of electricity on Shabbos and Yontif? So we know the Chazon Ish held that it's bona, and therefore it would still be an Isser Deraisa, lefi the Chazon Ish. We have early tshuvas from Reb Chaim Ozer and the Beis Yitzchak, who are of the opinion that using electricity would be a violation of Molid, which would be an Isser Derabanan. And we have Reb Shlomo Zalman, who speaks a lot on the subject as well. Let's leave it vague. The one thing we know is that electricity and Shabbos and Yontif is Aser. Why? Because they said so. Electricity is Aser. So you would think adjusting the oven is problematic, first and foremost, because I'm using electricity. And second of all, what is that electricity doing? That's turning on the coil. So I'm creating fire. On Yontif, you're allowed to transfer fire, but the Mishnah in Be'ah and Daf Lamed Gimel says explicitly, you can't create fire. You can't create fire in Yontif. So the Chiddush of Rav Heinemann was that when you adjust the temperature on the screen, or even you turn on the oven, you can't hear anything and you can't see anything. On a regular oven, you turn it on, you see that it goes on, the lights flash, and then it tells you what the temperature is. And as you adjust it, it goes from 250 to 275 to 300. Heinemann created the oven where you can't hear anything and you can't see anything.
Is it just a question of you can't perceive it, or is there a time delay?
So you can't perceive anything that's happening. However, as soon as you press that button, something is definitely happening within the computer. What's happening? It's sending a signal, a message. Rabbi Light, in 3.5 seconds from now, I want you to turn on the red hot coils. And they say, okay, we're on. You wait for 3 seconds, and then magically the red hot coils turn on. So we're going to explore every step of this process. The first question would be, let's say somehow you're creating an oven that it works through grama because the coils don't turn on right away. There's a nice 3-second delay. You could say Shalom Aleichem Rebbe Umori very slowly, right? And then it turns on. And let's assume for a moment, generally that time delay would be considered a grama. We don't view it as I'm directly turning on the fire.
Didn't I say that when you push the button, immediately electricity is...
Yes, when you push the buttons immediately, you're utilizing electricity, so we're going to have to address why is that mutter, right? But let's even say we're working with the assumption that for some reason using the electricity is not a problem, and we're just looking at the fact that I'm turning on this halachic fire, but there's a time delay, so maybe it's grama. So obviously on Shabbos, the Ramah would say, unless there's a real hefsed, you can't do grama on Shabbos. Okay, so this is not going to be for Shabbos. On Yontif is grama mutter even without a hefsed, so it depends who you ask. If you were to ask the Magen Avram and the Shulchan Aruch Harav and the Chai Adam, they would say, no, the Ramah stipulation applies by Shabbos and Yontif. So off the bat, according to the Magen Avram, the Chai Adam, and the Shulchan Aruch Harav, there's no eitzah of a grama oven on Yontif because grama is going to be usher on Yontif as well, unless it's mamish hefsid meruba hefsid or whatever chola. However, you could argue that if we're embracing the Mishnah Brura and the Aruch HaShulchan and the Maimer Mordechai, where they held that the Ramah's need for hefsid is only by Shabbos, but by Yontif there's no need for hefsid, grama is mutter on Yontif. And by the way, I don't think we ever mentioned the reason for that distinction, right? It's not arbitrary. You could argue the reason why there's an Isser D'Rabbanan of grama on Shabbos is because on Shabbos, we know the Isser of Malacha is much more severe. The Isser of doing Malacha on Shabbos is a kares. The Isser of doing Malacha on Yontif is a lav. So it could be that Chazal only came in and said, we don't feel comfortable doing anything, even a grama on Shabbos, unless it's a makom hefsid. But Yontif, listen, we'd rather, obviously no one should be doing a malacha on Yontif, but because the stakes are not as high, maybe they never made that Isser D'Rabbanan of don't do grama. So let's say we're going like the Mishnah Brura and the Aruch HaShulchan, Maimer Mordechai, that grama on Yontif is permissible, even without a hefsid. So now there's room to have a conversation. Okay, this is Grom on Yontif. The real question is, even if we're fully embracing the idea that the Ramah would say Grom on Yontif is mutter without a hefsid, when you're pressing those buttons initially, you're definitely utilizing electricity. So why in the world would that be permissible? So take a look over here on page 11. Page 11, second to last paragraph. Nira le'anias daiti. This is Rav Heinemann speaking. Sheyesh lo mitzad acher. That even if you were to tell me Gram man Yantiv is mutter without a hefsid, there's still a whole different issue you have to tackle, which is deha kishalochetz kavturim lahamid ataner al chom hadorush. When you actually are adjusting the temperature, bivadai nasa ezeroshem b'machshavai b'machsheva sheyesh b'hatanur sheyesh lochush bo le'eser. You're definitely creating an electrical signal in the computer of the oven. So then that playing with electricity should be aser. So here is one major chiddush of Rav Heidemann. He says, Mihu zehu dover yadua. It's a known concept throughout halacha. The kol isurei Torah heim rak mash biyadenu lahakir velasos. Anything that's aser is only that which can be seen and recognized by the human eye. Delo nitna Torah lemalachei shares. Ve'ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba betrunial imbriosav. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't give the Torah to Malachim, ulechein, and that's why he says you're allowed to eat cheese. Cheese, if you were to take a microscope, you would see it's filled with billions and billions of small little bacteria. Why is it mutter? She'enam nirim ha'ayidei einayim. She'nasan lanu HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The eyes that Hashem gave us, we can't see all the bacteria in cheese, and therefore you're allowed to eat it. Or you could argue the same thing when it comes to toloim in general, right? That was the whole discussion of bugs in the water in New York. Those who felt that it was not a problem, they were trying to make the argument that, of course we know there are copepods in the water, but you can't see them with the human eye. Those who were arguing that it would be a problem is that's not true. If you take it outside and you're looking closely, you don't have to have a magnifying glass. If you know what you're looking for, you could see it. But that was the whole debate. Is it nira le'inayim? So Heinemann had this incredible chiddush that when it comes to electricity, if there's nothing happening right now, there are no lights, there are no sounds, it's not nira le'inayim, and therefore, whatever the isser of electricity is, does not apply. That's a chiddush gadol.
Even if you're assuming it's a deraisa, not a
It sounds like even if you're working with the assumption that electricity in general is an issa deraisa, eating toloim is also an issa deraisa, right? Okay. Now, why is this potentially not so pashut? How could you hear a difference as to why this might be a little bit of a different shaila than eating cheese with microscopic bacteria?
And then the other thing is you do something.
We don't see numbers on the oven.
Right. If you were not to see numbers, you do hear a sound also, because of the coils they do make a sound.
Okay, but that's all happening a few seconds later. So you could argue, all that is grama. What I'm doing right now, there's no sound, there's no lights, there's no excitement.
I mean, by the case of the lion, HaKadosh Baruch Hu can't expect me to be nizer in something that I don't have a realistic way with the apparatus God gave me in my body to be able to perceive. But here, of course I know. The whole thing is a game. I know what's going to happen. I'm intending for it to happen. I'm making it happen. I'm going to see the results in a minute. So to say, well, Hashem can't expect me to know about this. Come on.
It's like using a marker that doesn't show up for 25 seconds.
Right now, the truth is that there is an interesting chakira in this whole concept of if you can't see it, it's not usher. Is the pshat that, listen, Hashem doesn't expect us to be neurotic. We could only live life based on what we could feel and see with our human senses. Anything beyond that, we're not responsible for. Or is it deeper than that? It's not just a limitation to our responsibility, but the pshat is that if lemaisa you can't see it, it has no halachic relevance at all. Bein lakula, bein lachumra. Meaning to say, that Tiferes Yisrael Mishnah speaks about this case. Let's say you have a fish, and it doesn't look like it has scales, so that it should be a non-kosher fish. If you look with a magnifying glass, you could tell, no, this fish has scales. Is it kosher? It's still treif. Right? So you see the concept of not nira le'enayim is not just a heter, it's not just a leniency, but it sounds like it's creating a metzias. Now this is far from pashut, and Kamat, all of the poskim had a very difficult time with this step, because bottom line is you're creating a mechanism where I'm utilizing this chashmal. I'm doing something so significant. This is part of the entire process where we're making a machine where there's electricity built in, that I'm playing with that electricity right now, and I know that it's going to turn on the oven in 3 seconds from now. Can I trouble you for some water? Is that shaykh? Thank you. So there's a lot to be said that this might be significantly different than the classic case of you can't see Taloim, they don't exist. Okay, this is one issue that was brought up by many of the other poskim. Another issue was, if you're in the world of the Evan HaOzer, where a machine that works, even if it's officially through grama, if this is the way you do it, even though I could do it in a different way, so that's not Ba B'Mikra, and maybe that wouldn't be any heter of grama in the first place. This is how the entire mechanism was engineered. Thank you very much. Now, Rav Heinemann could argue back, and he does. He says, that's true when you have rechaim shalmayim. This is the way it always works, right? This is the efficient way of grinding tavua bizman hazeh. I don't care if there's a time delay. The Evan Ozer would say that's your maisa. However, in our special Sabbath mode oven, this is not the way it generally works. Nobody would use it like this during the week. It's annoying, and you're not exactly sure what's going on. So it's only engineered that you could move it into this mode on Shabbos. So maybe that's also considered Baba Mikra, similar to the case of putting the kalim around the fire. And you could argue that's not Baba Mikra if it has this as part of its function. So that's how the thing is used on Shabbos. So, and there's a lot more to discuss. Also, this whole heter seems to only be assuming, like Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, in contrast to Ramosha, regarding that machlokas by timers. Reb Shlomo Zalman said, even though I'm putting something into motion, the fact is that it's a time delay, so it's a grama. The whole premise of this heter is fully embracing Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. If you're assuming, like Reb Moshe Feinstein, that adjusting a timer is considered I'm putting something into motion and that's my maisa, so then l'chora, this oven would be the exact same thing. This wouldn't even be a grama. This would be your maisa biyadayim. And anytime you're putting something into motion. So the same thing would be true here, l'chora. When I press the buttons, I'm adjusting the temperature. I'm creating this whole system where now it's directly going into the computer and it's going to turn on in 3 seconds from now. No, Ramosha was not relying on the Achiezer. He was saying not just because that's the way this thing is made, he felt that it's stam, the way we view this, as your extended maisa. So I'm just pointing out this entire heter might only be in Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Huh? There's no such thing as a grama when you're putting something into motion, and this is the continuity of that. That's the hamshacha. In the case in Shabbos, I'm just putting something, I'm putting the kelim around the fire. In the case of the rechaim shalmayim, where there's a debate, you could still say, I'm not setting something up. This thing is doing its thing, and I'm just putting the tavu inside there. So there are three basic issues. One is it seems to be relying on Rosh Shlomo Zalman in contrast to Ramosha. The second thing is that main chiddush of electricity not being a problem because we can't see what's happening, and then utilizing the principle of lo nit l'tor l'malachei shares is far from pashut, right? And the third issue is, if you're in the world of the Achiezer, you could argue that if this is the way the machine is made, it might take away the grama heter. Now, just because the time is late, maybe we'll hold off just for a second. I want to get to the halacha l'maisa. Right? There were many poskim who responded to this. Reb Shlomo Miller on page 12, after going through many of these points from the technicality of halacha, he also brings in some of his concern hashkafically. He says, first of all, if this technology can make something into a grama, then theoretically you could make anything on Shabbos. You could make a computer on Shabbos, you could make an electric scooter on Shabbos, you could make anything on Shabbos where you're mamish playing with electricity and it just has a built-in 3-second time delay. As long as you can't see my direct use of electricity, that's going to be grama. And that would matter many, many things on Shabbos if there's a hefsed or there's a chola. And lechora, that would matter all of these things on Yontif, even if there is no real hefsed, if you're assuming grama on Yontif is stam mutter. So he says, this is the last paragraph here. V'im natir devarim ke'elu, if we allow these types of things, halo nuchol l'sakein machshir lasos kol malacha b'Shabbos. You could create a machine to do anything, to record your voice, to have typing, to have any form of electricity. Uledaiti, third to last line, lefi svaras hamatir, yuchol lovo hirus gadol b'shmir Shabbos. If we allow this type of chiddush into the world, it can create a massive decay and corruption of Shmira Shabbos. L'chein she'amatir kavar asa, ma'isa midas atzmo, and the matir, right, the star K, they already came to the conclusion that it should be allowed. Lefarsem ba'America, this is Shlomo Miller talking from Toronto, right? Lefarsem ba'America, the halachos of Tanur, right? Mamish having like a pamphlet, this is how you're allowed to use the specialized oven on Yontif. Now, what he's alluding to here is something that I also heard from Rebelsky, Zecher Tzadik v'Kodesh Levracha. He said, putting aside all of the halachic issues that are involved here and some of the major chidushim, he was very concerned about the process. If you're coming out with a chiddush of this size, the way that Rebelsky put it was, we need more of a halachic system. The way that works is you have a posik, right? Someone of Rav Heinemann's stature, one of the great poskim in America. So write a tshuva on the subject and express, your idea and your chidushim and answer the questions that people might have. And publish that tshuva in a halachic journal. And then other great poskim will see that. They definitely recognize and respect you. Okay, so let them respond. If they have questions, right? Forget the whole kol kore thing. Have a nice, robust debate. They're going to have questions. They're going to write letters back to you. And you're going to defend yourself. And maybe some of those questions might change your opinion slightly, and you might tweak something. But if you get to a point where now there's a haskamas poskim, how we could utilize some of this chiddush and then put it out there for public consumption, that Rebelsky held was a lot safer of an approach. But to have one Adam Gadol come out with a massive chiddush that could have major ramifications, both in misunderstanding, misapplying halacha, and the hashkafa of Shabbos, Rebelsky was very, very much concerned for. So we have Reb Shlomo Miller's, he comes out by saying, Nirali sheyesh tzorich gadol, since in this case there was already this publication of the heter, he feels there's a tzorich gadol lahaskamas haposkim leisser. The poskim have to come out unequivocally and say, this is asur. V'chol harabanim shedebarti itam hiskimu leisser. And all of the poskim I've spoken to, they're on the same page. Right? So the reason why he was coming out so strong is because it was already given to the world, so to speak, as these are the halachas of the Sabbath oven. Now, Lemaisa, there are institutes in Eretz Yisrael, like the Tzomet Institute, that they specialize in creating grama devices. Now, often the grama they're using is a little bit different. There's nothing happening when I'm adjusting it. There's no electricity happening bichlal, so they're not relying on that chiddush of the starkei. What their system is that you're just doing something manually, and then let's say you have a sensor going off every 5-10 seconds to see where that switch is. So once that sensor picks up that there was something moved, then maybe it puts it into motion. Even those grama devices, you could still argue you get out of the issue of using electricity directly, but you still have the question of the achiezer. If this is the way it's made, maybe it takes away grama. And that's why poskim in general seem to say the grama devices really, you have to be careful with how to create them and then how to direct people in using them. Obviously, in situations of hospital settings or cases of real choli, real suffix sakana, that's where some of these things come into play. Meaning to say where it's kamat mutter to do the malacha anyway. So you might as well do it, but derech grama, if it's not going to cause any real issues in patient care. But generally, these types of chedushim, based on the strong response the Star K received, we're very, very hesitant with. Shkoyach.